So let me describe what you would have seen, which was a video about how someone imagined hearing the information from General Granger and then running over to their slave owner to tell them that they were free. So I'm going to be her, so she runs over. And she says, "I'm free. I don't have to work for nothing anymore. I'm free. You have to pay me wages." And the slave owner says, "You have got to be kidding. That is not true. That was only true for some states, but it wasn't true for you. And so you will have hell to pay if you don't continue to work for me." And they lived happily ever after. You know, that's how those fairy tales end, and they live happily ever after. And I think it's this piece that a lot of people want to think about Juneteenth, that Juneteenth happened and all of the enslaved people were joyful, they were free, and they lived happily ever after. Except it didn't happen like that. And I think that for some people, there is a need to latch onto that because it frees us from guilt of feeling badly about what happened in slavery. And so it's easier to say, well, see, it worked out in the end. They lived happily ever after. So I'm going to give you the short lesson on Juneteenth for people who have heard this from me. And I have to tell you, there's so much about it. I could probably talk for 15 years about different things that have to do with Juneteenth. So I want you to listen for that date, June 19th, as I give you this quick version. So September 22nd, 1862 is actually when Lincoln issued the first part of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it said that if the Confederate States didn't secede to the Union, that Lincoln would determine that everybody was going to be free, that all of the enslaved people, if they didn't cease their rebellion, would be free by January 1st, 1863. When they didn't, then, in fact, the proclamation was supposed to go into effect on January 1st, 1863, which was supposed to free those enslaved people. But there was a problem, because there were two factions. There was the Union over here, and there was the Confederacy over here, and Lincoln was over the Union, but he wasn't over the Confederacy. So he couldn't say that all people were free, because he had no jurisdiction over the Confederacy. That would be like the mayor of Florida determining that in California, we had to stop teaching people about Black history. He has no authority here. Yes. So the other thing that has to happen with legal pieces like that is that they have to go through the House and the Senate and then be ratified. That's what we know. And it even happened back then. So in 1863, the Senate made changes to the Emancipation Proclamation. And the House made changes to the Emancipation Proclamation. And in January 31st, 1865, the Senate and the House came together with their amendments to present. And it was submitted to the states for approval on February 1st, 1865. And then the war ended. And when the war ended, those two factions then changed, because then Lincoln had jurisdiction over everybody. Because he then, the Confederates seceded to the Union, and so he had jurisdiction over them, except 6 days after the war ended, Lincoln died. So he actually never got to do that. And so then there was General Granger, who goes to Galveston, Texas, to deliver the information that many people talk about, order number 3. And Granger happened to have not been someone who was in favor of freeing enslaved people, which a lot of people don't know. They think because he gave the announcement, he was all for it. That's not true. What he did was to create an order that would guarantee, to the best extent possible, that enslaved people would stay put. And so a lot of people were saying, a lot of slave owners were saying, it's going to be a mess for us if these enslaved people suddenly become free, then who's going to take care of cotton? And he said, I'll fix that. And so if you read carefully that order that many people look at and say it was this wonderful thing that freed people, it says, go back. It says, you're free, but we want you to go back. So that's where June 19th comes in. He delivered the order there, but the House, the Senate, and what was the third thing that needed to happen? Ratifying is what needed to happen. That didn't happen until December. And so June 19th, 1865, it was not ratified. So it was not actually in place. And so the order was an announcement. It was just an announcement about something that ought to be, but wasn't yet, because it hadn't been ratified, and a lot of states didn't want that to happen, and so it wasn't until the end of December, the beginning of December in 1865 that it actually got ratified. But here's the thing. Something that we leave out of the understanding of Juneteenth is just the insidiousness of the wording of the order itself. The very order given through Lincoln to President Johnson, who was actually the person who was in power when General Granger went to Texas, it contained the same limited information for the people who were supposed to be freed as was what happened to individuals in Africa when they were enslaved. It said, you're free, but you cannot congregate. You're free, but you should remain exactly where you are and be paid. But it didn't tell the slave owners that they needed to pay. It told the enslaved people that they ought to be paid. They ought to be. It said, in fact, you're free, and not only are you supposed to go back to where you were, but go back quietly, which means don't have a fit, don't raise a ruckus. If your slave owner tells you something else, don't cause a problem. It says, you're free, and so you have an equal right to what you own. What did they own? Nothing. But they had an equal right to that. They had an equal right to the nothing that they had. Harvard professor Greg Carr says that the compromises and the unfulfilled promises that followed General Order Number 3 foreshadowed the inequality and the fight for justice that Texas and our entire nation are still wrestling with to this day. What's also interesting that confuses some people when they listen to the idea of Juneteenth is this incorrect notion that freedom from enslavement put enslaved people in a better position that they were in than when they were in Africa. In fact, those stories that I used to hear growing up started with the Middle Passage. So people were taken from Africa, came to the United States, and it's almost like that's when Black history started. But we forget that life in Africa was far better before people were captured, forced to work, forced to bear children to add to the American economy, and treated like property. And then there's those photos of malnourished children in Africa, and so you think, oh, surely life was like that, and so even coming over here and being enslaved, that was better. However, the story becomes even more shocking and heartfelt when one realizes true African life before chattel slavery. Life in many countries in Africa were marked by kings, queens, mathematicians, and scientists. Art flourished, learning, technology of its time, and Africans were particularly skilled with medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. Historians mention that Africans had kingdoms and city-states, each with its own language and culture. The empire of Songhai and the kingdoms of Mali, Benin, and Congo were large and powerful, with monarchs heading complex political structures governing hundreds of thousands of people. In other areas, political systems were smaller and relied on agreements between the people at the village level. The other funny thing about how Africa has been portrayed is the conflating of cultures within the continent as though they don't exist separately and don't culturally exist. These are some of the cultures prior to enslavement. In fact, the richest man who ever existed in the world was Mansa Musa, who was from Africa. He made more money than anyone who has ever been on this planet. So there's this conflation that happens with cultures. You look at those eclairs, and people say, oh, eclairs, they come from France. You look at Dutch cheese. I think most people call it Gouda. My family calls it Gouda, because it's how you say it in Dutch. But you don't call French eclairs European eclairs, and you don't call Gouda or Gouda European cheese. But you do call this African. It isn't. It's Ghanaian. This particular kente cloth comes from Ghana and is created, that the fabric and the texture and the way that it is created comes from people from Ghana. It's within their heritage. It's not just African. But we conflate it into just one spot. Some people even call Africa a country rather than a continent, which I think is just geographically strange. And so there you have all of these different countries. There are so many different countries and things that come from that continent. And yet, when someone has an accent like Chris, and you say, oh, you have a French accent. And then someone who may come from Nigeria, someone says, oh, you have an African accent. Like, well, no, it's a Nigerian accent, which is different from a Ghanaian accent, which is different from a Sierra Leonean accent. Thank you, Gloria. But we forget that culture has to do with belonging, and it's the thing that got taken away first. It originates from this ease of conflating what is different from what we know. And then it causes someone to lose the sense of belonging that they hold within their country. Belonging is very important within the countries of Africa. Familial, regional, intergenerational. Elders are prized, and just being around them, just having them listen. Most conversations of any magnitude, you seek out an elder to make sure that an elder is present to hear the information and to give their input. Whether it's one or more, that just their presence is critical. That intergenerational connection is a part of belongingness. That belongingness is critical and life-sustaining. It's the human emotional need to be accepted as a member of a group, whether it's family or friends, coworkers, religion, community, something else. People tend to have an inherent desire to belong, to be an important part of something greater than self. A need to belong, to connect deeply with other people in secure places, to align with one's cultural and subcultural identities, and to feel like one is a part of systems around them, seems to be buried deeply in our biology, all the way to the human genome. The design of the human brain and the immune system work together to use belonging for us to keep ourselves emotionally, biologically, and physically safe. It's why you end up with this fight or flight when someone who is close to you gets sick or gets hurt. It's because it threatens your sense of belonging with them. That threat is what happened when Africans were pulled from their country. It was heartbreaking. And if you look at that picture of how the ships were and how the bodies are aligned, they're aligned head to foot to the extent possible, which keeps you from being able to communicate and connect. It made them vulnerable by removing all aspects of anything that allowed them to maintain a sense of belonging. They took away their language, separated families, took away their spiritual and cultural customs, anything that would connect them as a people, that would help them to belong, that would give them a sense of belongingness. And what we lost is the respect for equality of belonging. That is not just about us belonging. It's about us being united for the belongingness of everyone, because it's everyone's birthright. Scientists have discovered that we understand belonging. I don't think it's going. It may be going because yes, it was supposed to be a video as well. Scientists discovered that when we understand belonging best, we do it when we can understand the connections that we have to living things like ourselves. And so this plant, which you aren't going to see move, it's called a Mimosa pudica. And there was a scientific experiment and a series of scientific experiments to prove that plants have consciousness and that they respond to touch. And so if you've ever seen those plants that close up when a fly or a spider or something comes, a Mimosa pudica responds very similarly. All you have to do is just the slightest touch. So just take your finger and just go like that very slightly in your hand. That plant will close up. And if you can see the very bottom part of the picture, yes, it's where it's starting to, and it will close completely. Little by little, different parts of the plant will start to close when it is touched. There was another science research experiment that happened not too long ago. It was just on NPR about the fact that in a completely darkened room, if someone were to take a tweezer and tweeze the blade of the leaf of a plant, you will be able to see electrical impulses in the room, because plants do respond to touch. They do have that kind of consciousness. Extend that concept out to enslaved or disenfranchised people and imagine what they missed out on. Imagine how life would have been with connection, with belonging, with a smile, with a touch. And maybe, if I was to say anything that was good about order number 3, maybe it's the peace that order number 3 did. The announcement that Granger gave, even though he was trying to make things not change, what it did say was that they were people. And before that, enslaved people were considered property and animals. And so if there was a good thing about that order, the fact that someone could say that you should not congregate, that you should not be idle, that you should go back to where you were, those are things that people do. And so it moved them out of that concept of being nothing and a piece of property to at least recognizing on some level that they were beings, living people who deserved the right to belong, even though the order didn't give them that right. The fact that it said those things, that they were people, tells us that that in itself, it recognized one beginning in understanding that they were people. And I submit that it marked an announcement that even in the midst of its divided, limited, insidious language, that people needed to start to recognize the importance of belonging. That these people that they considered nothing and people and not people and property, that they had to look at them a little differently because there was a law in effect that allowed something else to happen. So it forced them to have to do something. And what it also said to those enslaved people is, I am worthy. I can't talk, I don't have anything, I don't know where I'm gonna go, but I am worthy of something. They belonged. They belonged to themselves. They belonged to this continent that they were excommunicated to, dragged into, whose sweat, as the poem says, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, and that despite that state of affairs, bears along with their indigenous partners the footprints of the recreation of where we live right now. It began a movement of recognition that Africans and their successors were a people, and that with that, they had an unstated, God-given right to belongingness. So I want you to just take that in for a minute. And if you'll just close your eyes if you're comfortable. Feel what that means. Imagine yourself having the belongingness stripped from you and suddenly starting to have a feeling that you weren't deserving of that stripping ever. On Juneteenth, may we remember that when we reflect on that announcement, and when we do our due diligence to learn the authentic history of that date, that we can remember that there were people who stood firmly and continually on the side of freedom, and still now, and who claimed and continue to claim each other's individual right to belong, where there are no borders, where there's no foreign language, where there's no abnormal differentiations, where there's no color hierarchy, where there's no classist divisions, where there's no sexual orientation delineations that divide. Only belonging, without person-made rules, without societal-made judgments. And may we see each person who is unlike ourselves as someone worthy of belonging. May we look at someone different from us that we may not understand, and may our first thought be, you have a right to belong here. May we move back, and may we witness allowing ourselves to appreciate others as they step up into their place of belonging. May we remember that belonging does not have only individual ownership. As much as belonging is our personal birthright, we must also safeguard that right for others. May that always, always be so.